"Ma'am, step away from the counter now." The words cut through the quiet pharmacy like a blade, sharp enough to turn every head but soft enough that no one dared respond. And in that moment, under the cold fluorescent lights humming overhead, a 72-year-old woman stood frozen, her fingers still lightly resting on a small white prescription bag, her eyes steady, calm, almost too calm for what was unfolding around her. Because this wasn't the first time she had been looked at like she didn't belong, and yet something about today felt different, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath waiting for something no one else could see coming. Officer Daniel Brooks adjusted his stance, one hand resting near his belt, the other gesturing toward her with controlled authority, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be absolute. His voice carrying just enough edge to make the young cashier behind the register step back and lower her gaze, pretending to reorganize receipts that didn't need organizing, while a man near the aisle slowly pulled out his phone, not to help, not to intervene, but to record, because that's what people did now. They watched, they captured, they stayed safely on the outside of someone else's moment. Evelyn Carter didn't move, not because she was defying him, not because she didn't understand, but because she was measuring something deeper than the accusation hanging in the air, her eyes drifting briefly to the name stitched across his uniform, Brooks, before returning to his face with a quiet composure that seemed to unsettle him more than any protest ever could. "I just came for my medication," she said, her voice soft but steady, the kind of voice that didn't beg, didn't plead, just stated a truth that seemed to echo strangely in the sterile room. But Daniel didn't hear it that way. To him it was resistance wrapped in politeness, and he had seen that before, or at least he thought he had, because assumptions have a way of sounding like experience when you repeat them enough. "We've had reports," he replied, his tone tightening just slightly, "and I need you to cooperate." And there it was, that word, cooperate, floating in the space between them like a test she had already failed in his mind, and somewhere behind them, a whisper slipped out, low but sharp enough to carry. She looked suspicious, followed by silence, the kind that spreads quickly when no one wants to be the first to challenge it. Evelyn's grip on the prescription bag loosened, not out of fear, but as if she understood something no one else in that room did. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, her presence grounded in a way that didn't match the narrative forming around her. And for a brief second, just a flicker, Daniel hesitated, not because he doubted himself, but because something about her didn't fit the script he was so used to playing. And yet he pushed forward anyway, because authority, once it starts moving, rarely stops to ask if it's wrong. "Turn around," he said, firmer now, and the sound of those words seemed to echo louder than they should have, bouncing off shelves lined with over-the-counter remedies and polished tile floors that reflected a scene no one wanted to fully acknowledge. And as Evelyn slowly turned, her movements unhurried, deliberate, she lifted her chin ever so slightly, not in defiance, but in dignity, as if reminding the room, or perhaps just herself, that who she was could not be reduced to what they assumed. And just before his hand reached for her wrist, she spoke again, quieter this time, almost like a thought slipping into the air. "Officer, you might want to be very sure about this." And if anyone had been listening closely, truly listening, they might have noticed that her voice didn't carry fear, it carried certainty, the kind that doesn't come from hope, but from knowing exactly what happens next. Daniel Brooks paused for half a second after her words, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but just enough for something unfamiliar to flicker beneath his confidence, because certainty like hers did not match the situation he believed he was in control of. And yet the presence of an audience, the quiet phones raised, the eyes watching from behind shelves and aisles, pushed him forward instead of back, reinforcing the version of reality he had already decided was true. "Turn around, ma'am," he repeated, his voice firmer now, as if volume alone could settle the unease he refused to acknowledge, and Evelyn complied without resistance, slowly placing the prescription bag on the counter as she turned, her movements measured, almost deliberate, as though every second carried weight that only she could feel. And when his hand reached her wrist, the room seemed to shrink, not because of what he was doing, but because of how ordinary it looked to everyone else, how routine it had become to see someone like her treated this way. The metal click echoed softly, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to send a ripple through the silence. And somewhere behind them, a woman shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Evelyn and the officer before lowering her eyes again, choosing distance over involvement, because involvement required courage, and courage was inconvenient in places like this. Daniel stepped back slightly, maintaining control of the space, his posture rigid, his gaze scanning briefly to make sure the situation remained contained. And yet the more he looked, the more he noticed that no one was actually moving, no one was leaving. They were all still there, watching, waiting, as if something unfinished hung in the air. Evelyn stood with her hands restrained, her posture unchanged, her chin still lifted just enough to suggest that whatever had just happened did not define her. And for a moment, she said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch, to settle, to press against the edges of the room until it became impossible to ignore. And then she turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes again, her expression calm, unwavering, and said, "Officer Brooks, do you know who approved your badge?" The question landed differently this time, not like a warning, not like a plea, but like a key sliding quietly into a lock that had not yet been turned, and Daniel frowned, the lines on his face tightening as confusion mixed with irritation, because the question did not fit the script, it did not belong in this moment, and anything that did not belong had to be dismissed. "That is not relevant right now," he replied quickly, too quickly, as if speed could erase the discomfort rising in his chest. But Evelyn did not argue. She did not push, she simply nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and then she spoke again, her voice steady, each word placed carefully. "Then you might want to call dispatch and ask them to check the name Evelyn Carter." And just like that, the air shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a current changing direction beneath still water. One of the younger officers standing near the entrance glanced toward Daniel, hesitating, his hand hovering near his radio as uncertainty crept into his expression, because there was something in her tone, something in the way she carried herself, that did not match the accusation that had brought them here. And for the first time since stepping into the pharmacy, Daniel felt it too, that quiet disruption, that small crack in the certainty he had been standing on. And it unsettled him more than any resistance ever could, because resistance he understood, resistance he could control, but this calm, this confidence, this absence of fear, it did not give him anything to push against. And without that, his authority felt less like control and more like a performance he was no longer sure how to maintain. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like something invisible pressing into the room. And for a moment no one spoke, not the cashier, not the customers, not even Daniel Brooks, who now stood there with his hand resting near his radio, his eyes fixed on Evelyn as if trying to read something that refused to be obvious, because everything about her contradicted the situation he believed he controlled, and that contradiction was beginning to spread, quietly, from him to everyone else. The younger officer near the entrance finally cleared his throat, his voice low but uncertain. "You want me to run the name?" And that question, simple as it was, landed heavier than it should have, because it suggested doubt, and doubt had no place in a moment that had already been decided, at least in Daniel's mind. And yet he hesitated again, longer this time, long enough for the sound of a phone camera adjusting focus to become noticeable, long enough for the faint hum of the overhead lights to feel louder, long enough for the control he thought he had to start slipping into something else entirely. "Go ahead," Daniel said at last, his tone clipped, controlled, but not as steady as before, and the younger officer lifted his radio, pressing the button with a slight tremor that he tried to hide, his voice careful as he spoke into it. "Dispatch, can you check a name for me? Evelyn Carter. Possible ID confirmation." And then came the static, the brief pause that always follows a request like that. But this pause stretched. Not because of delay, but because of anticipation, because now everyone in that pharmacy was listening. Even the ones pretending not to, even the ones who had chosen silence moments ago. Evelyn remained still, her gaze no longer on Daniel, but slightly downward, as if she had already stepped beyond this moment in her mind, as if what was happening now was simply catching up to something she already knew. And there was no tension in her posture, no urgency, only patience, the kind that does not rush because it does not need to. The radio crackled again. But instead of an immediate answer, there was another voice, sharper, more alert, cutting in with a question that carried weight. Repeat that name. And the younger officer blinked, glancing at Daniel before responding. Evelyn Carter. And this time the silence that followed was different, not empty, not uncertain, but loaded, like something had just been recognized on the other end that no one here could yet see. Daniel shifted his weight, his jaw tightening slightly, because now it was not just the room watching. It was the system listening, and systems do not hesitate without reason. Stand by. Came the response. Quick, clipped, and then the line went quiet again, but not for long, because within seconds, a second voice cut through, more authoritative, more direct. Unit on Maple and 8th. Confirm you are with Evelyn Carter. And the younger officer's grip on the radio tightened. Affirmative, he answered, his voice no longer as steady as before, and then it happened, not with noise, not with chaos, but with a shift so subtle it felt almost unreal. Hold your position, supervisor en route, the voice said, and that was it. No explanation, no details, just an instruction that carried enough weight to change everything. Daniel's eyes flickered, just for a second, but that second was enough for the first crack to appear. Because supervisors did not get involved like this over routine calls, they did not respond this quickly, this directly, and somewhere in the back of his mind, something began to connect, something he did not want to acknowledge, something that did not fit the version of events he had already committed to. Around them, the atmosphere shifted again, the whispers returning, but different now, softer, uncertain, no longer focused on Evelyn, but on him, on the officer who had walked in with certainty and now stood in the middle of something he could not fully control. And for the first time since this began, the weight of the room was no longer pressing on her. It was pressing on him. Evelyn finally lifted her gaze again, meeting his eyes with the same calm expression, unchanged, unwavering. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without moving even a step, she held more presence than anyone else in that space, and the truth that had been building. Quietly from the moment she spoke, her name now stood just beneath the surface, waiting, not to explode, not to shock, but to reveal itself in a way that no one there would forget, least of all the man who had thought he was in control. The sound of the approaching siren did not arrive all at once. It started faint, almost distant, like a whisper carried through the city streets, but inside the pharmacy, where time had already begun to stretch, it felt immediate, undeniable. And every person in that room heard it, not just with their ears, but with the quiet realization that something far beyond a routine call was now in motion. Daniel Brooks straightened instinctively, his posture tightening, as if preparing for inspection. But the confidence that had once defined his stance no longer sat the same way. It had shifted, slightly off balance, like a structure still standing but no longer stable, and he could feel it, even if he refused to name it. The younger officer lowered his radio slowly, his eyes flicking between Daniel and Evelyn, uncertainty now fully visible in his expression, because whatever name had just been processed on the other end of that line had triggered something that protocol alone could not explain. Outside, the flashing lights reflected faintly against the pharmacy windows, red and blue bending across shelves of medicine and polished floors, turning an ordinary place into a stage where something irreversible was about to unfold. And inside, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire space had agreed, without words, to wait. Evelyn Carter remained exactly where she had been, her hands still restrained, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, almost grounded in a way that seemed unaffected by the growing tension around her. And for a moment, it became clear that she was not the one reacting to the situation was reacting to her. The door opened with a firm, controlled motion, and a tall man in a dark uniform stepped inside, his presence immediate, not because of volume or force, but because of the way the room responded to him. Conversations that had not even started fell silent, movements that had barely begun stopped completely, and Daniel turned, recognizing the insignia before he fully processed the face. Captain Michael Harris, a name that carried weight not just within the department, but across every decision that mattered. Harris did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked forward with measured steps, his eyes scanning the scene once, taking in the details with a precision that did not need explanation. And when his gaze landed on Evelyn, something shifted, subtle but unmistakable. A recognition that passed across his face before it settled into something far more serious. "Officer Brooks," Harris said, his tone calm, but edged with something that did not invite misunderstanding. "Explain what is happening here." And for the first time since this began, Daniel did not answer immediately, not because he did not know what to say, but because the words he had relied on moments ago no longer carried the same certainty. They felt thinner now, less solid, as if they could not withstand the weight of the moment. "We received a report," Daniel began, his voice controlled but lacking the firmness it once held. "Possible theft. I detained the individual for questioning." And even as he spoke, the words sounded rehearsed, detached, as though he were trying to fit the situation back into a framework that was already collapsing. Harris listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, but his silence was not passive, it was evaluative. And when Daniel finished, the captain's gaze shifted briefly to the younger officer, then back to Evelyn, and finally settled on the restraint at her wrists. And that was the moment everything changed, not with a shout, not with a dramatic gesture, but with a single decision forming behind his eyes. "Remove them," Harris said, simply, directly, and the words did not echo, they did not need to, because their impact was immediate, undeniable, cutting through whatever authority had been holding the situation in place. And for a second, Daniel did not move, not because he refused, but because something inside him was still catching up to what had just been said. And when he finally stepped forward, his hands no longer carried the same certainty they had moments ago, because now, whether he understood it fully or not, the control he thought he had was no longer his to hold. Daniel Brooks stepped forward slowly. The small metallic sound of the restraint releasing felt louder now than when it had been placed, not because of the action itself, but because of what it meant. And as Evelyn Carter's hands were freed, she did not rush to move them. She simply let them rest at her sides, as if nothing had been taken from her in the first place, as if dignity was never something that could be restrained. The room remained still, every set of eyes now fixed not on her, but on the shift that had just occurred, because moments like this did not happen without reason, and everyone could feel it, even if they did not yet understand it. Captain Harris stepped closer, his presence steady, controlled, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that did not need volume to command attention. "Miss Carter," he said, with a tone that was no longer neutral, no longer questioning, but respectful, precise, and unmistakably aware. And that single change in how he addressed her sent another quiet ripple through the room, because respect, when it appears suddenly, always reveals what was missing before. Evelyn met his gaze with the same calm composure she had held from the beginning, her expression unchanged. But there was something else now, something beneath the surface, not satisfaction, not relief, but a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had arrived exactly as it was meant to. "Captain," she replied, her voice even, measured, as if they were continuing a conversation that had started long before anyone else realized it. Harris gave a slight nod, then turned his attention back to Daniel. And in that turn, the atmosphere shifted again, because now the focus was no longer on accusation, it was on accountability, and those are not the same thing. "Officer Brooks," Harris said, his tone firm but controlled, "do you understand who you just detained?" And the question hung there, not rhetorical, not aggressive, but direct, demanding clarity that Daniel no longer possessed. And for a moment, he said nothing, his mind searching for footing that had already given way, because the situation he thought he understood had moved beyond him, beyond procedure, into something far more serious. "No, sir," he finally answered, the words coming slower than before, stripped of the confidence that had once filled them. And that admission, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything he had said earlier. Harris held his gaze for a second longer, then spoke again. "This is Evelyn Carter, the civilian oversight director for the entire district," and the words did not need emphasis, they did not need explanation, because their meaning landed immediately, fully, cutting through the room with a clarity that left no space for interpretation. And just like that, the narrative that had been built around her collapsed. replaced by a truth that had been there all along, waiting to be recognized. The younger officer near the entrance shifted his stance, his grip on the radio loosening as realization settled in, and around them, the quiet murmurs returned. But this time they were different, no longer filled with suspicion, but with something closer to disbelief, because the person they had watched in silence, the woman they had assumed to be powerless, was now standing at the center of something far greater than any of them had imagined. Daniel's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his shoulders no longer squared in authority, but held in a way that suggested something else entirely, something heavier, something harder to carry, because authority, when it is misplaced, does not just disappear, it leaves behind the weight of what it has done. Evelyn reached calmly for the prescription bag still resting on the counter, her movements unhurried, unaffected, as if reclaiming something ordinary was more important than reacting to something extraordinary. And as she held it again, she looked briefly at Daniel, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a quiet steadiness that said more than any words could, because sometimes the strongest statement is not what you say, but what you choose not to. And in that moment, standing in a pharmacy that had become something else entirely, the balance of power was no longer shifting, it had already shifted, completely, and there was no going back to the version of reality that had existed just minutes before. The words did not echo, but their impact lingered, settling into every corner of the pharmacy like something permanent, something that could not be undone. And for a moment, no one moved, not even Daniel Brooks, who now stood in a space that no longer belonged to him in the way it had just minutes before, because the badge on his chest suddenly felt less like authority and more like a question he could no longer answer. Captain Harris shifted his stance slightly, his gaze steady, measured, as if weighing not just the situation, but the consequences already unfolding from it. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that left no room for confusion. "Miss Carter, are you injured or in need of assistance?" And the question itself marked another shift, not just in tone, but in priority, because the system that had moments ago been used against her was now aligning itself around her. Evelyn Carter gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, her expression calm, composed, as if she had already moved beyond the moment that everyone else was still trying to process. And in that calm, there was something powerful, something that did not demand attention, but commanded it anyway. "I am fine, Captain," she said, her voice steady. "But I would like to understand why I was detained in the first place." And the question was simple, direct, but unlike the accusations that had filled the room earlier, this one carried weight, because it required an answer grounded in truth, not assumption. Harris turned his attention back to Daniel, and this time there was no ambiguity in his gaze. No room for interpretation, only expectation. "Officer Brooks," he said, "explain." And the word itself seemed heavier than anything that had been said before, because now it was not about control, it was about accountability, and those are not the same thing. Daniel swallowed slightly, his throat tightening as he searched for the same words he had used earlier, but they did not come the same way now. They felt different, incomplete, as if they could not hold under the weight of what had been revealed. "We received a report from inside the store," he began, his voice slower, less certain. "Possible theft. I acted on that information." And as he spoke, he avoided looking directly at Evelyn, because meeting her gaze now required something he did not yet have. Harris listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his silence was not passive, it was deliberate. And when Daniel finished, the captain turned slightly toward the cashier, who immediately stiffened under the sudden attention, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the counter as she realized that the moment she had tried to stay out of had now reached her. "Did you make that report?" Harris asked, his tone calm but precise, and the young woman hesitated, her eyes darting briefly toward Daniel before returning to the counter. I thought something looked off," she said, her voice quiet, uncertain. She was holding items, and I was not sure. And even as she spoke, the lack of certainty in her words became clear, because suspicion, when spoken out loud, often reveals how little it is built on. Harris nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and then he turned back to Daniel. "Suspicion is not confirmation," he said evenly. and it does not justify immediate detention without verification. And the statement was not loud, not aggressive, but it carried a finality that settled into the situation with undeniable weight, because it was not just a correction, it was a line, clearly drawn, separating what had happened from what should have happened. Around them, the room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer passive, no longer uncertain. It was aware, watching not just the outcome, but the process, because now the story was no longer about a woman being accused. It was about a system being examined. Evelyn stood quietly, her presence unchanged, her posture steady, as if she had known from the beginning that this moment would arrive, not because she expected it, but because she understood how these situations unfold when truth is allowed to surface. And as she looked briefly toward the people around her, the ones who had watched, who had stayed silent, there was no accusation in her eyes, no resentment, only a quiet reminder that silence, too, is a choice, and choices, once made, cannot be unseen. Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, the weight of the moment settling fully now, because the narrative he had relied on had been replaced by something else entirely, something he could not control, something that would not be contained within this room. And for the first time, he began to understand that what had just happened was not a misunderstanding. It was a turning point, one that would not end when the doors of this pharmacy closed. The room did not return to normal. It could not, because once a moment like this unfolds, it leaves something behind, something that settles into the space and into the people who witnessed it. And as Captain Harris stood there, his presence steady and controlled, it became clear that what had begun as a routine call was now something else entirely, something that would extend far beyond the walls of this pharmacy. He turned slightly toward the younger officer, his voice calm but decisive. Secure all body camera footage and any recordings from this location. And the instruction was not dramatic, not urgent in tone, but it carried the weight of process, of documentation, of a system now turning inward to examine itself. And the younger officer nodded quickly, moving with a sense of purpose that had not been there before. Daniel Brooks remained still for a moment longer, his mind trying to catch up to the shift that had already taken place, because the role he had stepped into when he first entered the store no longer existed in the same way, and the badge on his chest, the one he had relied on for certainty, now felt like something being quietly evaluated, not by him, but by everything around him. "Officer Brooks," Harris said again, his tone unchanged but firm, "step outside." And there was no resistance, no hesitation this time, only compliance, because the situation had moved beyond his control, beyond his interpretation, into a space where decisions were no longer his to make. And as he walked toward the door, the same door he had entered with confidence, it felt different now, not just an exit, but a threshold between what had been assumed and what had been revealed. The door closed behind him with a soft sound, and inside, the atmosphere shifted once more, quieter now, but clearer, as if the room itself had exhaled. Harris turned back to Evelyn, his posture easing slightly, though his focus remained sharp. "Miss Carter, I apologize for what you experienced today," he said, and the apology was direct, not wrapped in formality, not diluted by distance, but grounded in recognition. And in that recognition, there was something important, something that acknowledged not just the incident, but the impact of it. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful, measured, and when she responded, her voice carried the same calm authority it had held from the beginning. "Captain, I appreciate that," she said, "but this is not about me." And that sentence, simple as it was, shifted the focus once again, away from the moment and towards something larger, something that extended beyond a single interaction. Harris nodded slightly, understanding not just the words, but what they pointed to, because moments like this are never isolated. They are part of patterns, of systems, of decisions made over time. And when those patterns are interrupted, even briefly, they reveal more than any report ever could. Around them, the customers began to shift, some lowering their phones, others exchanging glances that carried a mix of realization and discomfort, because witnessing something is not the same as understanding it. And understanding often comes after the moment has passed. The cashier stood quietly behind the counter, her hands now still, her earlier uncertainty replaced by something else, something closer to reflection, because the assumption she had acted on had not just been questioned, it had been exposed, and exposure has a way of staying with you. Evelyn picked up her prescription bag once more, holding it lightly, as if grounding herself in something simple, something real, and as she looked toward the exit, there was no urgency in her movement, no need to rush, because the moment had already done what it needed to do. But before she took a step, she paused, turning her gaze back toward Captain Harris. "Make sure this is not just documented," she said quietly. "Make sure it changes something." And the words did not carry force, they did not need to, because their meaning was clear, direct, and impossible to ignore. Harris met her gaze, his expression firm, resolute, and in that brief exchange, there was an understanding, not spoken, but shared, that what had happened here would not end as just another report. Filed away, because some moments demand more than acknowledgement, they demand action. And as Evelyn finally moved toward the door, the room remained still, not because it had to, but because everyone there understood, in their own way, that they had just witnessed something that could not be undone, something that would follow them long after they left, a quiet reminder that power, when misused, may act loudly, but truth, when it arrives, does not need to raise its voice to be heard. Outside, the air felt different, not because the temperature had changed, but because the weight of what had just happened followed them through the door, settling into the quiet street like a shadow that refused to fade. And Evelyn Carter stepped onto the sidewalk with the same steady pace she had carried inside, her posture upright, her expression calm, as if the moment behind her had already been placed where it belonged, not forgotten, but understood. Behind her, the glass door closed, softly, separating two versions of reality, one that had been driven by assumption and one now forced to face consequence. Across the street, a small group had already begun to gather, drawn not by noise, but by the flashing lights and the presence of authority, and among them, a man lowered his phone slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to reflection, because what he had recorded was no longer just a moment, it was evidence, something that would live beyond this street, beyond this day. Daniel Brooks stood near the patrol car, his hands resting at his sides, no longer directing, no longer controlling, just standing, and for the first time since the incident began, there was nothing left for him to do, no command to give, no situation to manage, only the quiet reality of what had already been set in motion. And as he watched Evelyn step away from the pharmacy, something in his expression changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that the certainty he had relied on was gone, replaced by something far less comfortable, something that could not be corrected with procedure or explained away with routine. Captain Harris exited moments later, his presence still composed, but now carrying the unmistakable tone of resolution, and as he approached Daniel, he did not raise his voice, he did not need to. "Turn in your report by the end of the day," he said, his tone measured, "and do not leave your post without instruction." And the words, simple and procedural, carried an undercurrent that Daniel understood immediately, because they were not just instructions, they were the beginning of something else, something formal, something that would move forward whether he was ready for it or not. Daniel nodded once, his response quiet, contained, and in that nod, there was no defense, no argument, only acknowledgement, because the moment for explanation had passed, replaced by a process that no longer depended on his version of events. Evelyn continued walking, her steps unhurried, the small white prescription bag still in her hand, a simple object that had become the center of something far larger than it should have been. And as she moved down the sidewalk, the sounds of the city returned gradually, cars passing, distant conversations, the rhythm of everyday life continuing as it always does, even after moments that change everything for those who experience them. A few people watched her as she passed, their expressions quiet, thoughtful, as if trying to reconcile the image they had seen inside with the reality now walking past them, because understanding does not arrive all at once, it builds, slowly, piece by piece, often long after the moment itself has ended. Behind her, the patrol car lights dimmed, the scene beginning to dissolve back into something ordinary, but nothing about it was truly ordinary anymore, not for the people who had been there, Not for the officer standing beside the car, and not for the system that had just been forced, even briefly, to look at itself. Evelyn paused briefly at the corner, not because she was unsure where to go, but because she allowed herself a moment, a single breath, a quiet pause that carried no visible emotion, only presence. And then she continued forward, disappearing into the flow of the city like anyone else. Except she was not just anyone else. And what had happened would not remain where it occurred, because somewhere, in reports being written, in footage being reviewed, in conversations that would follow behind closed doors, the truth of this moment would continue to move, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, the way it always does when it is no longer ignored. And while the street returned to its normal rhythm, the impact of what had unfolded remained, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet shift, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful change does not come from force, but from a single moment when the truth is finally seen, and once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. By the time the street returned to its usual rhythm, the moment had already begun to travel beyond it, not in noise or spectacle, but in quiet, deliberate ways, in the form of reports being filed with more care than usual, in footage being reviewed not just for procedure but for truth, and in conversations that would no longer sound the same after what had been seen. Inside the department, the weight of the incident did not disappear with the closing of a door. It settled into the system, moving through it, prompting questions that could not be ignored. Because when a single moment exposes a flaw, it does not stay contained, it spreads, forcing everything around it to respond. Daniel Brooks sat at his desk later that day, the same desk he had occupied countless times before, but nothing about it felt familiar now. The paperwork in front of him no longer just routine, but part of something larger, something that would be read, reviewed, questioned, and he understood, even without being told directly, that this was not simply another report to complete. It was a record of a decision that could not be undone. His pen moved slower than usual, each word carrying weight, because now there was no room for assumption, no space for interpretation that did not align with what had actually occurred. And as he wrote, the silence around him felt different, not empty, but observant, as if the system itself was paying attention. Across the city, in a quiet office where decisions shaped policies rather than moments, Evelyn Carter sat with the same composure she had carried throughout the day, the small prescription bag now resting on the desk beside her, a simple reminder of how ordinary actions can become extraordinary under the wrong lens. And as she reviewed the preliminary report already reaching her, her expression remained calm, but focused, because for her, this was never about a single incident. It was about patterns, about systems, about ensuring that what had happened would not be dismissed as isolated or explained away as misunderstanding. She paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the desk, and then she began to write, not with urgency, but with clarity, outlining the steps that would follow, the reviews that would be conducted, the changes that would be required, because accountability is not a reaction, it is a process, one that moves forward whether or not it is comfortable. Back at the pharmacy, the day had continued, customers coming and going, shelves restocked, conversations resumed, but for those who had been there, something had shifted, something that lingered beneath the surface of routine, a quiet awareness that what they had witnessed was not just a moment, but a reflection, and reflections, once seen, have a way of staying. And somewhere between those spaces, between the desk where the report was written and the office where it was reviewed, the truth of that afternoon continued to move, steady, undeniable, not loud, not forceful, but present, shaping what would come next in ways that no one could fully predict. Because in the end, it was never about a single sentence. It was about what that sentence revealed, about the distance between assumption and reality, about the quiet power of knowing who you are when the world tries to decide it for you. And as the city moved forward, as it always does, that truth remained, not as a memory to be forgotten, but as a line that had been drawn, clear and unyielding, a reminder that authority may speak first, but it is truth that has the final word, and when it does not need to be raised to be heard.